Hi, this is Ted Price, founder and CEO of Insomniac Games and host of the AIAS Game Maker's Notebook. On this podcast, I had an opportunity to talk to Christina Norman, who is a lead designer at Riot Games. Christina has some really unique insights on how Riot designs its game, League of Legends, and how they think in general about game design. What I found fascinating was her and Riot's focus on the global nature of games and how they can take disparate feedback from all corners of the world and create something that has a universal appeal. In this conversation, we go deep into game design. We talk a lot about culture and how a company like Riot fosters a unique culture. So please check it out. Anyone who's a fan of Riot, League of Legends, or game design in general, you're going to get a lot from what Christina has to say.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Christina, it is so nice to have you on the show because I know there are more than just a handful of League of Legends fans out there who would love to hear what you have to say.
Well, hey, Ted, thanks. It's awesome to be here. I love working for Riot. I love game design, but it's nice to get a break sometimes from all that and get out of the day-to-day focusing on making games to talk about games. So this is a really fun part for me about being a game developer.
That's cool. Well, I think we were just talking recently about how there aren't that many developer to developer conversations. And when
I know, right?
Exactly. None of us really get a chance to go in depth on what we do. And when I say there are more than just a handful of people who want to hear, I'm talking about a ridiculous number of people who play the game and are probably very interested in diving a little deeper in what the game means to you from a design perspective, from a career perspective. So I kind of want to just start from the beginning and ask, how did you get into game design in the first place?
Okay. So if this gets too long, let me know. But I was thinking about that because I knew you'd ask me about that. And that's always such a difficult and interesting question because I think there's a lot of common patterns that we have in the games industry for how we get in. But I think the personal story is also important. So like many other game designers, I was really into video games when I was a kid. I started as a gamer. Well, I'm still into video games, but I'm still kind of a kid. But I was just like really into it. And Wizardry, for example, was one of the first games that really blew my mind about what a game could be. Because I played Dungeons and Dragons. I love Dungeons and Dragons. That was my hobby. But the problem I had is no one else wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons as much as me. And then I found that with Wizardry, I could play a game that had many of the same qualities and met many of the same needs as I got from that weekly play experience with my friends, but I could do it whenever I wanted. And it was different and it was magical. And later on, I found out that Brenda Romero worked on Wizardry, and that was actually really inspiring to me because I had no idea at the time when I was playing it. She's a game designer, and I met her many years later and thanked her for that, and that was a really cool experience. But getting back to your question, so I played video games. I remember actually thinking to myself, as a kid, maybe when I grow up, I'll make video games. But I thought, there's just no way I could do that. Video games are too amazing. They're too magical. They're too special. I don't think I'm good enough to be one of those people. And so instead, I went into computer science and math, and I was thinking like, I like computers and math, and I'm going to get, a good degree and get a good job. And I did get a good degree and I did get a good job. And actually, I was had a very successful consulting career doing development of internet applications, which is a fancy way of saying websites to sell things to people. And it was very lucrative. But what I noticed was whenever I would go to work, I was always angry, angry or upset. And I realized, like a lot of people, that I didn't really like my job. And then I was like, do I want to do this for the next 40 years of my life or however long I'm going to work? I don't know. And it was actually a bit of a crisis. And at the time I was doing Warcraft 3 modding. So I had a couple really popular Warcraft 3 mods. And I was also a hardcore MMO gamer. So I was really throwing myself into my passion of playing games. And I was actually in a world's first World of Warcraft guild at the time.
Wow.
And
how did you guys know you were the world's first?
Well, I mean, when you're playing World of Warcraft at that level, you know everything that's going on. You know what every guild is doing on every server. So World of Warcraft had just come out. This is like the very early days, but our guild was the first guild to kill Onyxia. And at that time, everybody was focused on Molten Core, which was the first sort of full raid dungeon, because Onyxia was so strong. She was almost as strong as Ragnaros, the boss at the end of Molten Core. So everyone was focused on Molten Core. You would get more loot from that. There were easier bosses, and they were trying to progress through there. And our guild said, we're not going to actually be able to be the first at that, but we think we can be the first at Onyxia if we focus everything on killing her. And so we did. And that was pretty cool. For me, that was probably actually my biggest achievement in gaming.
Fantastic. I love it.
Back to how I actually got in the industry, though, I kind of had a bit of a wake-up call at that moment in terms of saying, I am so passionate about games, I just have to try and get into games. And thankfully, I met a game developer at Blizzard through playing Warcraft 3 and modding and playing World of Warcraft. His name was Tom Cadwell. Now he's the design director at Riot. And Tom was the one who actually really encouraged me and said, you are smart enough to be a game designer, at any studio. Just go out there and try and be one. So I applied everywhere. One of the challenges I faced being in Canada was it's really hard to get a job across the border when you don't have any industry experience. So I was pretty much limited to applying to Canadian studios. And then Bioware, thankfully, the third time I applied to them, actually let me apply, but they wouldn't let me apply for a game design position. They let me apply as a programmer. So I said, okay, if you want to let me be a game designer, I'll be a programmer. And in that interview, when they said, all right, we're going to hire you. And then they said, so do you know what game you're going to work on? And I said, no, but I hope it's Dragon Age. And then they said, it's not Dragon Age. And they couldn't tell me the name because at that time it didn't have a name, but it turned out that game was Mass Effect.
Oh, wow.
And that was how I got into the games industry.
And so what were you programming on Mass Effect?
Well, I didn't really get much choice being, the new kid on the block, so to speak. But Bioware has a really, really great culture. They were very trusting and open. And they actually ended up giving me one of the most important things about Mass Effect, the conversation and cinematic system. So these days, I think we've come a long way. But at the time that Mass Effect came out, the way they did conversations with dynamic camera shots, lip sync, facial animation, and so on, it was really leading stuff.
Yeah.
People had done that at exceptionally high quality, but no one had done it at the sheer volume of content that Mass Effect did. So I worked on that system.
What a great experience. I mean, I remember that. I remember we talked about it here at Insomniac because we would look at it and ask ourselves, how do they do that? How could they create so many possible outcomes and make it as convincing as they had? So it was
there's a
impressive.
real art to it. I always follow like various game design lectures on conversation systems and ways of managing dialogue and choice, and there's some really interesting GDC talks on that. But a lot of it really just comes down to craft expertise. One of BioWare's really strong points is the writers there who've been there for a while. They truly, truly understand how to craft experiences with the types of tools and approaches that BioWare uses. And that's what it's all about. It's not about hiring like, the best writer, the guy who knows how to write real good. You need to hire people who understand when they're writing how that's going to turn into the experience that players have, because writing is just words.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's sort of the magic when it happens, right? When you get that intersection between narrative and design that suddenly works, it's a special moment, and we struggle with that all the time. I think most game companies do.
I think most game companies do, because it's always a series of trade-offs. It's not just a pour more narrative on this game like ketchup.
Right.
You need to find the right way to fit it into the game and make it authentic. And there's even just different goals in terms of what you want to succeed with. So I think it's a complex subject, but it's also an invaluable tool in making players relate to and understand your game and care for it on a deeper level.
Well, did you bring that expertise and that love of story and narrative to Riot when you moved over?
I kind of did. So in some of my earlier days on Mass Effect, on League of Legends, when I joined Riot, I actually helped with doing some of the early planning for the IP. So as everyone knows, Riot had no idea when we made League of Legends that it would turn into a game that over 100 million players play. And when I think of that number, it's hard to understand. But I'm Canadian, so I always think of it as being like, oh, that's like 3 times as many people as live in the country where I'm from. And then that puts that in perspective. So
I think you should repeat that, just because it is crazy. Riot or League of Legends has 3 times the number of players that Canada. Right, it's 3 times the size of Canada's population.
Of Canada. And the way we track players is we don't track, you logged in to answer a message. You have to play a game, or we don't count that as an active player. So we didn't, in doing pretty much any of our choices about how we built the game, really think of building it for that size of audience. And we couldn't have built it for that size of audience with the small, scrappy team that was there at the start. And I should note, by the way, because I don't want to take any credit for the work that happened before League of Legends came out, I joined Riot after League of Legends had come out and after those initial choices had been made. But it was pretty early. It was within the first year or so.
Wow. Okay.
But the IP was one of the things that hadn't been focused on that much. And so I tried to just get some best practices in place there in terms of making creative choices that would help us build a world that we could more easily tell stories in, where characters had realistic motivations, where there were pre-existing relationships, there was cultural history. I worked with the team to sort of put that in place, only for about 6 months or so. And then after that, I helped establish the team that went on to continue and develop it. And they are still doing so today. All right.
Do you get to read all the stories and sort of call them up or email them and say, guys, this is great, or guys, not so sure about this?
I don't actually do that, because in my view, it doesn't really matter what the internal perception is. It's really all about how the players think and feel about it. So, and one of the things, when you've been in a company for a while and you're in a position of respect, you also learn to be careful about feedback, because it can carry a lot of weight, sometimes even unintended weight. So I just think carefully about how and when I give feedback in terms of whether or not it's going to be helpful.
That makes sense. I mean, let's talk about audience perceptions and about your global audience, because and I think there's an interesting aspect of story, right, and how it works or doesn't work for your global audience. So first, with as many players as you have, how much of the world would you say League covers?
I don't fully know, to be honest. We're always moving into new countries and out of countries. And one thing to think about here is the way Riot tends to expand into a new country is not because we do a bunch of market analysis and say, oh, if we go to this country and we advertise League of Legends, we think players will play it. What we actually do is we look at where are players playing our game.
Okay.
Because we don't region lock anything. Anyone from any country can generally make an account to play League of Legends in any country. I think there might be some restrictions in Korea and a couple other places for legal reasons, but we don't seek to restrict that. So, for example, like we launched in Japan a little while ago, and the reason why we launched was we had enough players from Japan that clearly there was a need, and thus we went to Japan to serve that need. So that's kind of the way we approach it, and I think it's a nice approach because it's very aligned with our values that we're trying to serve players in terms of how we operate versus trying to capture a market opportunity.
Well, do you do any culturalization as you move into new territories and learn more about new players?
So, sorry, what do you mean by culturalization?
Do you change any of the stories, say when you're localizing,
right,
the bios of the heroes, for example?
So we've had a few different approaches to that over time. One thing that Riot has as a value is we believe that when we launch in a new region, we always establish a team that is dedicated to serving the needs of that region. For smaller regions, there might be a team that is serving several smaller regions, but we always have people whose job is to specifically make those players happy. And then we imbue that team with a great deal of trust about what the best way to do that is. So, for example, in Brazil, I know there have been a lot of additional stories that have been developed for that region seeking to better serve the players in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And I think the trade-off we have there is that we also think, though, but if within a region we deviate too far from the base IP of the game, then there's a danger that maybe we will release something new, like, a video or a short feature or a comic book. And then even if we localize it to that region, it won't make sense because there'll be a conflict with the stories that are told in that region. So I think we've been iterating slowly on that, but we're leaning more towards establishing sort of consistent core IP and stories across regions. We do, however, strongly encourage that localization is done with a view towards the region itself. So, for example, we have a lot of jokes in our champion voiceover, and jokes are the sorts of things where it really, really matters about the culture, the cultural context for the joke. A lot of the things that we come up with that we think are hilarious really just, they don't make sense in other cultures. So we're actually, for example, in that case, we give regions a lot of freedom to just completely rewrite dialogue lines if for some reason they don't make sense in one region or the other.
Right. That's a great example. And so do you rely on your teams on the ground there to say, hey, this isn't funny, this is what we should do, or you just assume that whatever comes back in its localized form will be funny to the local populace?
Well, we really put that burden on the teams. Yeah. So we essentially give them the mission of saying, hey, we're going to be constantly building and publishing and putting out updates to this game. And we always make sure that the teams receiving the updates don't have to do work for the update to go out, because we never want players to not be able to play because, in the Brazil office, something happened and now the patch doesn't go out. But we really work hard to communicate with the teams and give them the time and the context they need to be able to do high quality localization. With that said, I would say that's the goal. And I don't think we're always happy with the results, but if so, that perspective first comes from the team themselves in terms of them saying like, oh yeah, we think we could have done better with this.
Well, I think the fact that you make the effort to do that kind of culturalization at that level is unique. I mean, I think most of us who have been developing for a while tend to be, at least in America, fairly America focused. And I know we've run into issues before where our humor fell flat overseas and we had to rely on our producers overseas to help us understand what would work. But given that you are in so many different places, that does sound like it. And
we do have to be vigilant though about that, I think, because so first of all, like, I agree with you. I would say it's not the default, I think, for developers in North America is to be North American centric because that is our experience. That is what we know. And it's only through education and awareness that you can become cognizant of these issues and think about them. However, also, we don't necessarily want a graphics programmer to need to be educated in cultural awareness. So, we try and make sure that people have the information they need to do their jobs well. And also, it's always a conversation. So it's always values-based versus directives-based. We always talk about the goals we want to achieve. We empower the teams to pursue those goals. And we rely on best practices that we share to help teams pursue those goals. But there's never, a top-down moratorium that says, and so you need to do this, this, and this.
Yeah, well, that's great. So speaking of that, and sort of switching over from story to just game design and tuning, do you find that you get different types of feedback on gameplay itself depending on the region?
Oh, absolutely.
How do you address that? Is same approach? You just delegate to the team and say, guys, if you need to tune the prices on these items, or if you need to tune the difficulty,
the gameplay is 100% the same in all regions.
Okay,
and that's the reason for that is because League is a competitive game, and we are aware that extremely small tuning changes can have vast unintended consequences.
Right.
Also, League is a sport, an esport, and part of what we offer players is they know that they are playing the exact same game that the professionals are playing, and there's no difference. And for that reason, we have this requirement that everything is absolutely the same. But the goal there, I think, is to ensure that every player in every region can capture the full value of this competitive experience that we're offering.
So how do you take all of that disparate feedback, which must, as you mentioned, must be different from region to region, and pick what's truly important when it comes to that global tuning that you're doing, given that everybody's playing exactly the same game?
Well, I think so. It's interesting. I'm super passionate about global game design and understanding how players in different regions are different. But the great thing about a competitive experience, I think, is that you don't actually need to tune it for different audiences. It's possible that some audiences might appreciate one competitive experience over another. But I think for us, it's hard enough to get one competitive experience just right. And that's what we're constantly focused on. And I think because of that, we believe that even if, for example, players in Korea are measurably, on average, better at certain aspects of the game than players in a different region, that doesn't mean that the game needs to be tuned differently for those Korean players. Regardless of what region you're always going to have people at a mix of skill levels. So, for example, Brazil, I mentioned before. The top players in Brazil would do very well in any region. The new players in Korea would have a similar experience in any region. There are differences in the regions, but it's more about kind of the distribution of competitive skill across a band, and less so about one region having different needs than another in terms of a competitive experience.
Okay. Do you have heated debates though internally over the, say, what you're seeing from region to region and what really matters?
So again, I think it comes down to whether we're talking about the competitive aspect or other aspects. So, for example, I would say in skins, we spend a lot of time, and for those listeners who aren't familiar with League, skins are the cosmetic outfits that we sell that players can put on their characters to make them look different. And players really love skins, which is great because otherwise I wouldn't have a job because they pay my salary. So there we definitely see a range of cultural appreciations and preferences, and we're constantly looking at how different skins resonate with players in different regions, seeking to try and understand. But there's some really surprising stuff in there. Like, for example, there's this one skin called Uncle Rise. Rise is one of the main sort of characters in League. He's very popular and very well known. And Uncle Rise is one of our older skins where he kind of looks like, I'm Canadian. Who is that American with, Uncle Sim? That's it. Yes. Should have been able to get that. So Rise looks like Uncle Sam in there. He's got an Uncle Sam outfit on it. And players in China love this skin. In America, it's an old skin. It's not really used that often. People, maybe a few people have it, but in China, they just love it. And I wouldn't have necessarily anticipated that, but I can understand it. For them, it's a little bit of kind of like a characterization of the United States, I guess. So there's very unexpected things there. One of the really interesting things I think about League throughout all this, and I still don't fully know how we managed to do this, but it's very rare for a game to have art and character styles that resonate across many cultures, and we seem to have succeeded at doing that. And while we think about that a lot today, we didn't think about it a lot at the start. So I think there's probably a little bit of luck as well as a little bit of planning in terms of how we've managed to get characters that resonate so well with players across the world.
Well, given that is now a fact, can you dissect what you think really is working consistently across different cultures visually for the character design?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it was about not trying to jump too deeply onto archetypes that resonate really strongly with specific cultures and taking a bit of a softer approach. So if you look at League from a character perspective, what you're going to see is it's very diverse. And by that, I mean, no two characters really look alike. And we really do try to differentiate characters quite a bit. And because of that, I think that we've managed to hit more archetypes that resonate with different cultures. So even if one doesn't resonate as well in one culture as another, there are enough characters around who do resonate. So for example, one of our very popular characters in China is Ezreal, and he looks kind of like a 16-year-old boy. And he's got like kind of that youthful masculine archetype going, and that does really, really well in China. But then we also have characters like Darius, who are more sort of like, it's more like The Rock, I guess. He's like more of like sort of a hyper masculine alpha type, and that resonates better in North America. So by having these different characters that are using sort of popular, global, accessible archetypes, but not going too deeply on really trying to make the game about any one type of archetype, I think we do well.
That makes sense. And I think that's a great lesson for all developers, because we're all generally looking to address a global audience, and it's difficult. It's really difficult for us to know what is appreciated in other territories, and try to adjust our characters to fit this sort of unknown desire without. I think sometimes the trap we fall into is diluting our the image of our game and what we have in it. And you guys have managed to retain a really unique visual style from the very beginning, with all of your characters, with the items that you can get, and also with the maps.
Yeah. So part of the thing there is like, it has to be great. If you're going to make something that players are going to latch onto, first, it has to be fantastic. It has to be valuable. It has to be great. And that means that as developers, you can try and educate yourself as much as you want about different cultures, expectations, and perceptions. But in the end, you have to put out something that has that intrinsic value and quality to generate that resonance. If you take more of like a marketing style approach in terms of saying like, well, we need 3 of these and 2 of these and 4 of these and 1 of these, and don't do that, then you're going to end up with something that's a little more wishy-washy and bland, and players recognize that.
Right.
So the way I think I would put it is, the way that we made a game that resonates so strongly with players in China and Korea and other countries is not by making a game that they think was made by a Chinese developer or a Korean developer. It's by making a really, really high quality game that has a lot of appealing content that they care about. And generally, I think our players understand that this is an American game, and when they play it, they're looking for that type of experience. Just like I'm playing Xenoblade Chronicles 2 right now, and I'm totally not looking for that to be a Western RPG experience. I'm absolutely into the whole JRPG thing right now.
So do you play a lot of other games from different regions?
I do, actually. So it's hard. It's hard, but it's not that hard. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, on the one hand, I want to acknowledge it's not that easy to play a game that is in a different language. But on the other hand, particularly for any game developers out here listening to this, don't be lazy. Don't say, oh yeah, I'd love to play a Korean game, but it'd be so hard. It's really not that hard. I tend to play a lot of mobile games because they're some of the easier ones to access. And honestly, that's where a lot of the gaming trend is going right now. Anyway, it's a really interesting space. So, and you can, whether you're on iPhone or Android, there are pretty easy legal ways to get access to the vast majority of these games. So there's on Android, which is my primary platform, there's an app called Quoo app, QOO space APP. Just Google that, download it, and you can play so many games. It's just insane. But for how long do I actually spend playing those games? It kind of varies. At least 5 to 10 hours a week, I would say. And, if I'm really intensively into a game, it might be quite a bit longer. Lastly, since you asked, I'll mention 2 games that can be easily played in the North American app stores right now, ports in English. Lineage 2, that the mobile version of that is available, and it's, by the way, I hate it, but that's neither here nor there. But it's an autoplay MMO. I don't hate it because it's Lineage. I love Lineage, but I just have a lot of trouble understanding autoplay MMOs, which is why I play them, because I'm trying to understand them. Another really good one to check out is Soul Hunters, which is an older game now, but it's just a great little RPG. It's so addictive. And if you hate microtransactions, okay, you don't have to pay to play, but you'll have an easier time if you put $5 or $10 into it. And it's just a great little RPG that scratches a lot of the same itch as MMOs. And these types of games are huge in China. They're like the 3rd most popular genre in China, I think.
Do you find yourself taking any specific design lessons away from these that you can apply to either something you're doing now or something you think you'll do in the future?
My instinct was to say no, but then I thought about it. I'm like, no, I do actually. So I think it's similar to, I'm going to pontificate a bit here, but I think like for a lot of game developers who've been working for a while, everyone remembers when Facebook games suddenly became a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all like, these games are terrible. Why are so many people playing these terrible games that are just about getting money? And if you took the time to look at them and study them and understand them, you'd realize that they were serving specific player needs that were not being otherwise served. And in the same way, I think when mobile games started out, initially not that great, a lot of like really dumbed down experiences. And I still think there's a bit of that going on. But underneath all that there's some really beautiful refinement of experiences that exist outside of mobile phone gaming being represented in this more limited platform and experience. So I do think there are lessons to learn. And I think they're about translating and realizing experiences in different platforms, which is of fundamental importance to all game developers, because I'm not playing on the same type of device I was playing on 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5 years ago. Things keep changing. So if we as game developers want to remain relevant to our audience and give them what they want and need, we need to recognize that we can't just draw on our own personal experiences, love, passion, and history for games. We also need to look forward and seek to understand and empathize with the experiences of players today and think about the experience of players 5 years from now.
That makes sense. And I gotta say, I'm with you on that. I'm not as adventurous as you are in terms of going to other regions and playing mobile games from other regions. I tend to get sucked into whatever my kids are playing because it's my bonding experience with them.
That's a great use of time.
It is. Well, I have to say, I do pull in a lot of design insights from those games because we make games that aren't those. But at the same time, I think to your point, there are a lot of fundamental design approaches that we can all take that will keep players engaged for longer, whether it's a mobile game that you normally play for 2 minutes or a AAA game that you're playing for 20 hours. I think there are some core lessons that we all need to pay attention to.
Yep. I should mention also just one tip, because this is a common trap I see that people fall into. They'll download a mobile game, they'll start playing it, and they'll hit something they don't like about the experience, like some sort of like advertisement or paywall, and then they'll be like, aha, this game is crap. And maybe it is. But what I found is most of the lessons I've gotten from these games involve just kind of acknowledging that and moving on.
Right.
Because it isn't just like 90 plus Metacritic games that have lessons to teach us. Some of the best lessons are buried deep beneath a not very good experience.
Absolutely. I think it's an excellent point. I think we need to learn sometimes what not to do. And you don't get that unless you have played games that are perhaps not as appealing to you or maybe to a whole sector of the audience. And it is work sometimes to jump in and play those games and then but then there are those hidden gems within pretty much all games, I think.
Yep.
I mean, every game is generally reflects somebody's passion.
Yep.
Right. And something that they wanted to communicate to their audience. And we have to sometimes unravel that for ourselves and see if we can identify with that particular passion.
Yeah, I really, I challenge myself whenever I'm playing any game that I'm not enjoying or that I'm thinking is lower quality to say, find what's great and magical about this game. And it's funny, often when you find that thing, you think to yourself, this isn't here because the producer of the game put it in or the CEO put it in or the marketing guy put it in. this is here because there was a developer working on this game who was really passionate about what they're doing. And they made their portion of the experience exceptional. And that's why I think there are so many gems hidden inside of games that might not on the surface level seem to be a great source of lessons.
Absolutely. So speaking of that and of developers' passions, I want to kind of talk a little bit about Riot as a company. And I think many of us in this industry have just been stunned with how fast and how large Riot has grown over the few years. But one thing I hear frequently is that everybody plays.
Yep.
And how does that work at Riot?
So this is, of course, ever changing. So what I mean by that is I've been at Riot for 7 years now, and I haven't played League of Legends every day of all 7 of those years. I think for the first 3 or 4 years I was there, I definitely played 4 or 5 days a week at least. And but I take breaks and then I come back. And just recently, the ranked season was coming to an end, and I played about 200 games in 2 months, for example, which is more than I'm playing on average. And now I'm taking a bit of a break, but I'm really excited about the new rune system, so I'm going to come back soon. So just like players, we sometimes take a break because we have other things that are going on. But we play because we have a passion for and a love for the game, by and large. So the vast majority of the people at Riot are people who are passionate League of Legends players before they join. But if we made that a restriction to join, then we wouldn't be able to actually hire some talented and amazing people. So some people do start playing after they join. And there's even some people who play who are like, what, this isn't really my type of game, but I'm still going to play it because I need to be able to understand what the players are talking about. And I mean, literally, if you don't play League of Legends, then you will not understand what players are talking about. That's not something that you can translate. So I think that even for the people who aren't finding that League is their passion, that's what draws them in, is just this understanding that we can't really serve the players unless we empathize with them. If we empathize with them, we'll achieve that through understanding them. And to some extent, that's through having the same experiences they have. And it's kind of interesting. Over the years, Riot has pushed further and further closer to the player experience. So when I joined Riot, all the Riot employees had basically unlimited Riot points, which are, that's the currency we use for purchasing items in game. But we also had like a few other privileges, like we could skip login queues in certain circumstances, but people would use those, just because. And we just started taking all those things away because we realized that unless we were going through the exact same experience the players have, that we couldn't really empathize or understand how they were experiencing it. So that's, I guess, a good just general lesson to look at is really think to yourself and play your games like a player. And if you've got a bunch of special privileges and if you don't have to experience all the pain that your players are experiencing, you're not really going to empathize with them.
Has that resulted in some big changes in the game since Riot points were taken away and everybody had to just log in as a regular player?
I wouldn't say big changes because our cultural value of thinking like a player has always been there. So this is more like a refinement. But for example, I think once we took away the unlimited Riot points, we definitely started to get more feedback on internal feedback, that is, on how valuable different things were to players. So people paid more attention to that, and they'd be more likely to give feedback in terms of saying like, hey, maybe that was good enough for a 750 RP skin 2 years ago, but these days, as a player, if I'm not going to spend 750 RP unless that skin has this or that.
Yeah.
So now I think we're getting more internal feedback like that.
That sounds really useful. I mean, just because it sounds like a game like League needs that constant tweaking and tuning, right? Where you have to be relevant to your audience and you have to keep them coming back.
Yeah. Well, and I think we just do that by listening to the players at the most basic level. Like we have to keep things simple because we prefer to focus on improving the game and building the game. So let me give a more concrete example. So for those who don't play League, we're an esport and we have positions kind of like in any other sort of sport game. For us, they're top, mid, bot, support, and jungle. But what many people don't know is that Riot didn't decide that those were the positions. Players actually decided those were the positions. So the actual language of esports and our roles was by and large created by the players as they figured out the best way to play the game. So we'd always sought to make League a competitive game experience, but we don't consider ourselves the architects of what a great competitive experience in League of Legends is, or at least we see that as a partnership with the players. And over time, for example, we've been consulting more and more with pro players, as well as players who are really good who aren't pro, because they actually have very different needs. So in addition to receiving more general feedback and doing deep data analysis.
Okay. Well, and so that deep data analysis, I mean, that is something that's fascinating, given that you have so many data points. How often are you doing an analysis and then?
It's all live, updated in real time, moment to moment, second to second, without delay. It took us a long time to get that structure working at a scale that could operate for League of Legends, but it's there. And it's important because collecting new data is really hard when you're working with 100 million players. It takes a long time to roll out changes. So we've been focused more on broad general data collection with a great real-time pipeline so that we've got all this material available. And that way our insights team can work with individual teams to help them access that data to get the most that they need out of it to answer the questions they're trying to answer.
What is a question that a team might have that they would get, where they would get the answer from data?
Sure. So I'll talk about an example of how our relationship with data has evolved over time. So early on in the days of League, we actually tried to keep designers away from a lot of our data because we essentially wanted to have the design analysis of the balance and the play balance of the game to not be statistically driven, because we've seen statistically driven changes can often result in the wrong changes. Like, for example, let's say you have a champion who has a 55% win rate. Maybe you think, okay, this champion's too powerful, I'm going to nerf him. But the real problem is that this champion synergizes really well with an item called Zhonya's Hourglass. And maybe the right way to do it is to actually change that item or to make a change to the champion that isn't so much about reducing their power, but reducing their synergy with that specific item. And designers are better able to sort of observe and understand those things. Over time, however, we realized that not giving designers access to data was making it harder for them to actually realize when and where those insights happen. So what we had to do as a company was deal with our internal fear that if we exposed too much data to the balance team, that we would become a data-driven company instead of an insight-driven company. But really, the answer was we just needed to do a little bit of training because we hire really smart people. And, you know, if we should have been actually more trusting to our balance team that we could expose them to this data and say, hey guys, just so you know, we're not asking you to just tune to the data. But as a result, now we're better able to find problems. So here's an example of a problem we might not have found as easily before we did this. When you look at something like champion win rate, which is a good general indicator for balance in the game, what we look at is what's the win rate in a bunch of different situations. So, for example, a champion that has a high win rate with highly skilled players, but has a low win rate with lower skilled players, needs to be tuned in a different way than a champion that has a high win rate with low skilled players and a low win rate with high skilled players. Also, there are sometimes just really strong and specific combos and synergies between specific champions. So then you have a situation where maybe you look at a champion's win rate and it's 55%, but if you dig a little deeper, you say, oh, this champion let's say it's a marksman character, which is played in conjunction with a support character. That's part of the meta of our game. Let's say there's a really strong synergy between Caitlyn and Janna, and the players have figured that out. And for that reason, 30% of the time, if Caitlyn's playing, so is Janna. Mm-hmm. That requires a different balance strategy than Caitlyn just having a high win rate. So now we found that by training our designers, giving them access to data, they're actually doing way better stuff with the data than we were getting before when they were a little more isolated. And by the way, the isolation is ancient history. I'm talking 5 years ago. So for most people, the experience they've been having in League has always been informed by a pretty close relationship between game designers and data.
Fantastic. I think you probably make most of us very envious that you can get that data so fast.
But at the same time, I know right now there's League of Legends players listening to this going, she's crazy. The balance is terrible. The balance kind of is terrible. So what I mean by that is I think for any game of this complexity that changes so often, we are constantly fighting to get the balance in a good place. And that's a struggle we expect to never end because we are a dynamic game. We are not chess. We are not going to become this fixed experience that never evolves. And as part of that, that means we are constantly working to bring and maintain balance until the next big change comes in.
That makes sense. But something you just said about your players who are saying one thing or another, it seems to me that you are balancing this immense amount of hard data with sometimes the vocal minority who has a very strong opinion on certain aspects of the game. And so how does one meld those two to come out with a sort of conclusion about the tweaks that you need to make?
Yep. So I can talk about that. And I think this is a case where it's really important to look at things from two different perspectives. And this is me speaking personally about how I think about this. So when I see a vocal minority representing a view, generally that view has to resonate with a larger group of players, or else it will just die off in the noise as long as there's conversation going on. So I'm not really too concerned that a truly, truly tiny number of players will get too much attention on an issue, because I just think the nature of conversations on social networks and so on these days is sufficiently sophisticated that ideas do need to resonate with a large number of players for them to gain traction. Still, though, when you're talking about a 100 million player game, that large number of players still might be a fraction of the player base. So it won't necessarily be representing the experience of that larger player base. So one thing we seek to do is, and this depends on the timing of the issue. For short-term issues, we can't necessarily do this, but we will try and survey players randomly to ask them how they feel about different aspects of the game, so we can compare sort of more how the baseline statistical player base as a whole feels about an issue, as well as what the player perception on that issue is. And of course, the player perception on issues can also vary greatly from region to region. So looking at this holistically, we can then get a general sense of how widespread this is and how resonant it is. But you can easily fall into a trap there. What I mean by that is that type of statistical analysis will almost inevitably end up in a situation where for almost anything you could say like, well, but it's really just not affecting that many players. Because the top burning issue in North America for North American League of Legends players often statistically isn't affecting the experience of that many players worldwide as a whole, but it's still affecting a lot of players. And you also have to think about what is your relationship with this hardcore engaged community, because that's what the vocal minority is. They are your hardcore engaged community. They are to some extent the thought leaders for the player base as a whole. So I think what we recognize there is that regardless of whether or not issues being raised by that community do resonate with the player base as a whole, we need to understand and try and address those issues because you need to have a good relationship with your hardcore player base. At the same time, we won't do anything that we feel is bad for the game. So I actually can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but there have been cases in the past where we did things that it was difficult for us to reach full alignment with the player community, that it was a good idea, but we nonetheless felt that it was a good change for the game.
Were you floating the ideas past the community first before you implemented them?
You know, that's interesting. Our communication is super organic. So when we're developing, well, first of all, as much as possible, we actually try and keep it so that whatever we're working on are things we can discuss with players, because that's much easier. When you have secrets that you're keeping from your players, that means you can't get feedback very early. So we try and talk about things with players as early as possible. And if we don't talk with players about something we're working on, it's usually because we think the amount of time from now to when the players will see it is too long. Players aren't that interested in talking with you about something that's going to happen in 2 years. That's really a more frustrating experience because if they don't want it, they'll be, why are you working on this? And if they do want it, it's hard for them to say, why is this going to take so long? So we tend to talk more about the things that are upcoming. And then in terms of how we talk, it's really a very organic process because we encourage everyone at Riot to talk with players. So usually what happens is individuals will reach out and consult with different groups of players that they know and trust. But then we'll also do research to try and ensure we're getting a broader perspective, because most developers at Riot are North Americans, and most are primarily talking with a North American audience. Not everyone, but most. So that kind of organic research does tend to be fairly North American centric.
I though am amazed that you encourage everybody to reach out to all players. I think that's fantastic.
It is pretty amazing. I think, there's bumps in the road. Like every once in a while, someone from Riot says something really dumb and pisses the players off. Yeah. And, but I think it for one thing is it just makes things a lot easier. At Riot, we have one message. The message to the players is the same as the message internally to Riot. And because there's one message, when we talk to players, we never need to worry that we're saying the wrong thing. And I think that's actually just a lot easier. And it has risks associated with it, of course. But if your company is truly player focused and is trying to serve the players and their needs, then why shouldn't you just tell everyone at your company to talk with the players about what's going on?
That's a great question. I think everybody should. That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like Riot has definitely unified its vision so well, and that it's just it works on many levels. So that's great to hear.
One of the things that you also need to think about, though, when you are talking with players, and we've definitely had some bumps in the road there, is speaking outside of your subject matter expertise. because generally when you're talking with players, they don't know the difference between a QA manager or a product lead or so on, or they may, but there isn't a very clear mapping there. So I get questions all the time that are outside of my expertise. And I usually just, say, hey, I don't actually know that. And if I do know a writer that I can connect them with to have that conversation, then I'll offer to help with that.
That's great. So with so many writers who are involved with both the community and with creating the game, how do you decide which ideas are going to be tested out and put in?
Oh, wow. That question is a question I think we actually really struggle with. And I think if anything at Riot, we have so many things we want to do. There are so many great ideas that we want to pursue for players that we sometimes spread ourselves a little too thin. And the way we decide is fairly organic. So when an idea has enough resonance and support within rioters who want to work on it, then usually that results in a proposal being made. And then we do, some basic checks like, hey, this would require 30 programmers. All of our programmers are working on other things. How are we going to work that out? So we do some basic checks in there to see whether or not we have the capacity to take it on. But I think sometimes the ideas resonate so strongly, we're like, we have to take this on. And that's how we end up spreading ourselves a bit too thin. And I think that's one of the things we're kind of learning is that maybe we need to focus on fewer things, but do them better. Because players aren't happy when you deliver something and it's at 80%. They're really not. Like, players want things delivered at 100%.
I think that's something we all struggle with. Right? We all want to put so much into our games, and whether they're ideas generated from the team or from our players, it really is hard to find the time to do that. But the fact that you guys do encourage ideas from, sounds like, all corners of the company is really incredible. And so with that in mind, how would you broadly describe Riot's culture?
Well, that's a great question. I think the most important thing is that we're a culture first company. And I'll be the first person to say that when I joined Riot, I didn't join because of the culture and values. I really liked the culture and values, but I didn't join because of it. But now that I'm here at Riot, and I've been here for a while, I've become a bit of a culture warrior. And I think it's actually a great retention strategy for Riot because it makes it really hard to think about working anywhere else, because all of a sudden it looks like a lot of other companies just don't measure up. I'm never going to work for a games company where I have to say, sorry guys, we've got to screw the player now because money. I'm just not going to do that. And so yeah, that's something I think that really just permeates Riot from top to bottom. There's also just this hardcore player identity. So I think most games companies, most of the people who work there are gamers. But at Riot, we really do take that to an extreme. We've hired so many people out of the player community. There's so many talented people at Riot who this is their first job in games. So I'll give a great example. Medler, who's the lead gameplay designer for League of Legends, he's from New Zealand, and he was a civil engineer, and he played a lot of League of Legends, and he just applied. And he ended up getting through the process, and he stopped being a civil engineer and he became an associate game designer. I remember us hiring him. And I remember when he started working, I don't know if Ziggs was his first hero that he worked on, but he worked on a lot of our most beloved champions, and I've seen him grow. And there's so many people like that. There's so many people at Riot who were just, they loved League of Legends. They were smart. And they were just like, man, I wish I could work on this game. And we hired them and now they work on this game. So that's how we get people to align with our game and our culture and our values, is we hire people who already align with our game and our culture and our values, even if their resume experience isn't, as good as someone else.
That's a great approach. We've had a similar situation as well. One of our creative directors on Sunset Overdrive came to Insomniac as a corporate lawyer, but he applied as a junior designer and took a massive pay cut to come here. And then, he was passionate about games. And he was passionate about what we did, and eventually just worked his way up to become a creative director. So it is wonderful when I think when companies can say, it doesn't matter what you do now. If you're passionate about what we do, passionate about our games, and you're willing to learn, then there's a place for you here. And it sounds like that's what Riot is saying to people.
Definitely. I don't really care that. So I love experience. When I'm hiring someone, I love experience, but not because I think they're going to have specific skills like, I need someone with 3 years of system balance experience. It's just more for the collective learnings that allow them to take on entirely different problems. So that's the value of experience, not so you can do the same thing over and over again. It's so you have the problem-solving tools to take on entirely different challenges.
So speaking of experiences, just to jump outside of Riot for a second, what kind of things do you do when you're not working or playing games?
So I read a lot. Lately, I've been reading a lot about neurochemistry. And I'm also really interested in quantum physics. I come from a very academic family. I'm the black sheep because I didn't get a graduate degree. And I just love learning. So I am constantly studying and learning whenever I am not working or playing games. I'm a bit of a social recluse. And that's kind of my thing. I mean, I just want a comfy cave where I can read and play games, and then the best job in the world, being a game designer. So no complaints.
I have to ask though, since you're reading about neurochemistry, right? Are there certain things that you can bring to game design from what you learn about neurochemistry?
Well, so I'll answer that in more general. Like, part of the reason I read about neurochemistry, I also read about cognitive science and philosophy, is understanding how people think and experience and process information and how they feel, trying to build up better models for understanding that. And yeah, occasionally those can be applied in games, but you have to be really cautious about that stuff, because often those theories, when they're applied, can become extremely blunt. I'll give an example. So this is a discussion I was having recently about reaction times. So I've read a bunch of studies on the reaction times of people to visual stimulus and how that information is processed, and how there can be sort of different levels of reaction that have different delays associated with them. It's really good from a theory perspective. But if you try and apply that literally in a game in terms of timing your visual stimuli based off of how long someone's going to process that information so that they can react, you're ignoring a bunch of the other aspects of the game. So, for example, in League of Legends, a lot of the skill of the game is in mentally modeling what is happening. So you don't dodge a skill shot from another character because you see them cast it and then you dodge. Or at least that's not the best way to describe it. It's more, you understand that this is likely going to happen, and thus you're ready to make the right decision at the right time when there's the right circumstances. And that can be very subtle. It's not just the casting animation. It can be a slight adjustment in their positioning that is signaling that they're going to cast. But also then, of course, that then becomes part of the mind game of the game and how you play. And anyone who plays Blitzcrank will know what I'm talking about. Blitzcrank is this character in League who is really good at grabbing people from far distances and pulling them in. And Blitzcrank players spend a lot of time doing mind games just around moving, trying to signal that maybe they're going to come and rush at you and grab you, so you react and pull back. But 90% of the time, they're just fainting.
That sounds like an infinite rabbit hole one could get into in terms of anticipating the feints and or not, and trying to read players who are trying to read you. I mean, that sounds like a lot of fun. The fact that you're, though, diving into that sort of analysis based on some of the things that you're studying or working on outside of work is, I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
And I think the important thing with doing this type of seeking to understand things and is to provide different models and frameworks within which to discuss problems. So often when people approach something from a feels-based tuning, when you're tuning on a set experience to try and produce the best results within that experience, that can sometimes be too limiting. So sometimes what you need to do to make something feel really good is actually change the rules or constraints of the surrounding system to enable a different type of experience. But if you don't have strong frameworks in place to understand why changing those variables could be valuable, then it can feel just like you're doing random things.
Yeah.
So talking about these different frameworks like reaction time as a neurochemical process, the real value of it is how it can then prompt discussions about how we can take that into account in terms of our overall game design frameworks.
Did it take a while to build up those frameworks and to really recognize that you had them?
They're constantly building and constantly changing and constantly being thrown away.
Yeah.
It's not like we have a giant library of frameworks and over time we're relying more and more on the library. Frameworks constantly grow and adapt to meet the current needs of our players and our products. And I say products because we do hope to release other games. We are Riot Games, not Riot Game. But League of Legends, for example, has incredibly sophisticated, well-developed League-specific frameworks. But the other games we're working on, their frameworks can be very different.
Well, I think even mentioning a framework and acknowledging that it's an important element of game design is special. I don't think that necessarily every developer really thinks about frameworks in that way. Like a series of maybe constraints or rules within which design happens or player behavior happens. And that's something that I don't think really gets talked a lot about in the industry, mostly because we're talking about the surface aspects of the games, the visuals, the story, the design that reacts to the player versus getting deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you're saying is totally correct. And I think part of the challenge of focusing on more sort of discipline, academic thought processes there, which is really like frameworks do fall into that, is there can be, I think, a lack of trust, particularly amongst the teams, in terms of what teams really care about is that the changes you're making and the vision you're following makes sense and is building towards something better. So I personally love frameworks. I spend a lot of time thinking and working within them, but one of the things that I've learned is that you can never justify a change or justify why something should be done within a framework, at least in my practical experience working on any team. To get true buy-in, you need to also be able to describe it as a series of iterative changes. So like one way I might think about it is I often think of myself as like right now I'm working on a lot of third order problems. So, a first order problem we need to solve today, second order problem, the problem that's going to happen because we solve a certain problem today. And then the third order problem is that's the next problem that'll happen after we solve the second one. And further down the line you go, the less likely it is that reality will align. but you do need to think ahead to not just be stuck in an iterative loop that, potentially isn't going anywhere. But what you do today, what the team focuses on, that's usually almost entirely driven by first order problems.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, regardless of how great your third order problem solution might be, you have to pick the solution that will resonate strongly with the team in a first order sense. And as long as you have trust and confidence in your ability as a designer, you should be okay with that, because we all know along the way, things aren't going to work out exactly as we planned. Things are going to change, and the actual best solution to that third order problem is going to be something different, or maybe that problem won't even happen. So the planning ahead process is really more about constantly being aware of the ever-changing state of the future and giving up a sense of control or certainty about how you'll address those third order problems is, I think, a really important part of working with normal human beings, is the way maybe I'd phrase it.
Well, it's funny you say that. I think in my experience, we tend to have a very concrete view of how things are going to unfold and some pretty specific predictions, regardless of what data we have, because we all have opinions about things and we rely on whatever experience we have. Mm-hmm. So how do you, with the design team, how do you help people keep an open mind when they're talking about abstractions like third order problems, without going to well, no, this is not going to happen because I've seen this before and you're wrong? How do you keep that conversation lively and evolving?
Wow. Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I think a lot of Riot's cultural values actually help out here. So when I look at my own history, I definitely come from more of sort of a debating background, where I personally love going into detailed debate discussions where people are trying to argue points and win an argument and so on. But that's not what collaborative development is like.
Sure.
So first off, if anyone first of all, have an amazing team. That makes everything easier. So if you don't have an amazing team, don't worry about these types of things. Focus on getting an amazing group of people together who you want to work with. Then you can say, okay, if anyone has a concern, that in itself is the problem. And then you relate to them as an individual, you talk with them, and you have to be open to the fact that your perspective isn't right. Or usually the way that manifests is there's actually a different perspective, a different problem, a different way of evaluating the situation other than you're looking at. And mm-hmm. There is no true right or wrong here. So it's complicated, it's messy, but I think what it comes down to, I guess at the most basic level, is all these different techniques I'm talking about. These are my techniques. Mm-hmm. And I do share these techniques with others who are interested. I do sometimes use them within workshops to solve complicated problems in a group. But in the end, what you're really trying to achieve is ideally consensus, but if not consensus, enthusiastic alignment.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's enthusiastic alignment that we're not doing the thing that I want to do, because it's not that I'm wrong necessarily. It's just that everything's a series of trade-offs. So we have to pick our battles, and moving forward is better than arguing endlessly about how we should move forward.
Definitely. I think we all need and want decisions when mm-hmm. we're on part of a development team. So just my last question, which is sort of a broad question, for anybody who's listening who either loves the games that you're working on, mm-hmm. loves League, or just wants to get into design mm-hmm. in general, what general advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I get asked that an awful lot. So one thing I get, I'm going to talk specifically about design, I think, because I think that is something I can speak to a little more deeply than the general, how do I get into games question. Mm-hmm. So first of all, I would say game designer means a lot of things. It's a very loosely defined discipline. So when I talk about design, I'm talking more about the formal process of design, the establishment of constraints, the understanding of goals for experiences you want to produce, and the application of abstract solution patterns in different contexts. But that's nerd talk. A lot of game design is craft. It is the direct generation of personal experiences. So the way I like to put it is you give any game designer a series of tools and tell them to make an experience with it, they will make that experience. And then the people who made those tools will say, oh my God, what did you do? And the game designer will say, well, I worked around all the problems with the tools to make the experience.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect too. And both, I think, are equally important. So if you want to be a game designer, I think the first thing is to just ask yourself, why do you want to be a game designer? What is it that you see that you will be doing as a game designer? And really, really understand that. Because the actual jobs and roles within game design may or may not relate to that experience you want. So try and seek to understand, like just read books about game design, read interviews with game designers, understand what it is that they actually do to make sure that it's what you want to do. Then in terms of becoming a game designer, I think there are so many ways to do it, but the basics are you got to play a lot of games and you have to think critically about those games. So, but that can be as easy as just talking with your friends about them. Like, I actually think a lot of what I learned about game design just came from playing games and talking with people about them beforehand. I'm amazed at how much I learned by doing that. And you probably should be able to articulate problems you see in games and how you would do things better and in fairly concrete terms. Another thing is these days, anyone can download Unity and make a game. The barriers are so low right now that, and hey, I got started in the Warcraft 3 modding tools, which were amazing. So get out there and actually try and practice that craft. None of this will actually help you get your first job in the industry, though. That's an entirely different problem, and it's a hard one. And I actually think there's a lot of barriers in place. Speaking from a purely practical perspective, like I got in because I was a very experienced computer programmer. So I got hired as a programmer and then I transferred into design. That was my story. I couldn't get in the door to become a designer. It's hard. So you might have to approach it from whatever angle can work for you. So you then have to ask yourself, like, am I passionate enough to sort of take on the challenge of just getting into the industry? And you can be really ruthlessly pragmatic about this. Like, simple things you can do is move to a city where there's a lot of game development studios, because it's a lot easier to hire someone who's already there than someone you have to relocate. That's not necessarily easy, but compared to some of the other challenges of getting into the industry, like that's a fairly small step. So if you want to take on that burden, then yeah, start by developing a bunch of general skills that games industry hires for, and move to cities where there is game development.
That's great advice. Thank you. And if people want to ask you more questions or get in touch with you, how will they do that?
I'm on Twitter. So I don't post that much anymore, but Truffle, Truffle, I definitely read all the messages that are sent to me, and I try to reply to them as often as I can. So that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Fantastic. Christina, thank you so much.
It's been great chatting with you, Ted. Thanks for doing this. It's been a lot of fun.
Right on.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.